Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, ever since Donald Trump announced his executive order to temporarily suspend for 3 months immigration to the United States from 7 foreign countries in the Middle East and Africa that are considered to be dangerous hotspots for exporting terrorism into the West, there has been a massive outpouring of emotion and protest and social media commentary and memes and media commentary. It is this issue that has captured the world's attention for the last 3 or 4 days, and man, has the emotion flying around been extremely intense. One of the things that I have noticed in particular has been the trend from a lot of people to talk about the moral imperative. What is our moral obligation in regards to taking in immigrants and refugees? And a lot of people have been even quoting Bible verses, people who aren't even Christians, and they are saying that this is a violation of Christian teaching, that this is something that Jesus would be ashamed of, etc., etc. So I thought that there was a good opportunity to try as dispassionately as possible and hopefully as systematically as possible to explore this question: what is the Christian teaching on immigration and refugees? And I guess then to explore the secondary question: has Donald Trump, by issuing this executive order to temporarily suspend immigration and refugees from those 7 nations, actually violated Christian teaching? Has he done something that Christianity would consider immoral here? And I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have. Now, before we go any further, though, let's start from the very beginning and sort of, as I said, try systematically to go through this. And the first place I think that's important to start is to explain that there is a difference between an immigrant and someone who is an asylum seeker or a refugee. And there are different moral issues at play. There is no moral obligation on a country to take in immigrants. There is no... no one has the right to claim that they have a right to turn up in your country and we're talking by choice here, to leave their own homeland under no pressure or coercion, to pack up their lives and come to your country and to demand access. So that's a different category of person who wants to come and stay and make a home in your nation, as opposed to refugees and asylum seekers. And asylum seekers and refugees are people who have been forced from their homes because of perhaps war or persecution or some sort of natural disaster, earthquake or flood or the likes. And because of that, you have different moral issues at play here. They are now vulnerable persons. They are now effectively homeless people. And there's no doubting that there are different moral factors here, and also that Christianity has some very specific things to say about this, because Christianity obviously talks about some of the issues that are affecting people who find themselves homeless and vulnerable. The second thing I think that's worth starting on is by pointing out the fact that there is technically no such thing as a Christian teaching on immigration, or what immigration policy should look like. There are, in fact, only teachings within Christianity about how we should treat other persons and how we should obviously show respect and love for other persons, and how we should care for those who are vulnerable and who are in need. So, for example, some of those teachings that are found in Scripture are from the book of Exodus, chapter 22. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. From Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. 3 John chapter 1, verse 5, beloved, it is a loyal thing you do when you render any service to the brethren, especially to strangers. Mark chapter 12, verse 31 is the famous story where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he responds by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind and soul, and you shall love your neighbour as yourself. And he says that these two are the greatest commandments. And then, of course, there is the famous story from Matthew chapter 23 of the goats and the sheep. And Jesus says there, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. And in this particular parable, those who had done these things, who had welcomed the stranger, who had fed those who were hungry, who had cared for the least and the most vulnerable among us, they are granted entry into heaven, whereas the people who didn't do this were sent to hell. So it's pretty clear what Christian teaching is when it comes to the fact that we are called to care for the vulnerable, to treat the stranger with respect, and to show care for them, to shelter those who are homeless, and to, as best we can, meet the needs of those who are in need. And obviously that has a big bearing on the question of, how we would treat someone who is a refugee, someone who is homeless. However, there is no specific mention of what immigration and refugee policy should actually look like, and this is where things get a little bit more complex. In fact, this is a very complex issue, a very nuanced issue when you start to talk about trying to apply these teachings at the level of an entire society. How should a nation actually structure its laws in regards to refugees and immigrants? How should it respond to these issues? And it's very dangerous to do what some people are doing at the moment, which is to cherry pick bits of scripture and then say that we should use them as a literal immigration policy or a refugee policy, that these should be literally just extrapolated to the level of a governmental policy on how we should respond to this complex issue of refugees who, particularly in large numbers, who are looking for a home. What's interesting to note, by the way, is that there are some people who are now quoting the Bible, some of the very same people who just months ago, when the whole marriage redefinition, the gay marriage debate was happening, were mocking and ridiculing and saying that Bible verses like these should not be taken literally. And now some of these very same people are saying that they should be taken as literal interpretations for how an immigration policy, a refugee policy, should actually run, and that you should have basically open borders to anyone who's in need. So I find that there's a sort of a delicious irony there that, as I said, months ago on a different issue they were cherry picking, and now on this issue they're claiming that we should be taking the Bible literally again. So let's break the issue down into the practical reality of the situation on the ground. What can a country do when it is confronted by the need of people who are refugees, who are asylum seekers, who need to find some sort of shelter, some sort of protection, some sort of redress, some sort of care for the situation that they are in? There's really only 4 ways that your country could respond, I think, to this situation of refugees. The first way that they could respond is they could say, no, we do not care for, we do not shelter, we do not take in refugees at all. No refugees from anywhere at any time. And it's pretty straightforward and clear that would be very clearly be a contrary position to Christian teaching. That would be a clear violation of Christian teaching to say that we are never going to help the vulnerable in any way, shape or form. So that's option 1, and that's definitely not a Christian response. Number 2 would be to say that we have a totally open border, that we will take anybody at any time and any number of refugees. It doesn't matter who you are, how many there are. Our borders are always open to you, and we won't have any screening or security measures. If you're in need, come to our country and we will look after you. Whether it's 10 refugees or 10 million, we'll take you. Now, some people have been trying to suggest, or I've seen some people trying to suggest, that this is the authentic Christian response, and this is what an authentically Christian immigration policy or refugee policy should look like. That's not actually true at all. This is not really an authentic Christian response at all. The Christian response isn't just as straightforward, like I said, as cherry-picking 1 or 2 of those scriptures and then saying that we should apply this to our immigration policy, our refugee policy, and just take this as a literal statement of how things are supposed to operate. Christian teaching is always, in a lot of these particular moral areas we're talking about now, is always about not just one virtue, it's about balancing the virtues. Because if you don't do that, if you don't keep an eye on important virtues and keep these things in balance, then you can end up falling into error. So you can start out thinking, we're really showing love by doing a certain action, but if you don't operate with the virtue of prudence, for example, you might not actually be loving someone at all. You might actually effectively be doing harm, even though it might feel like you're loving them. So it's kind of important to keep these things, to keep that balance, if you like, between some of what you might call competing interests, or competing obligations when it comes to morality. So, for example, on this issue of immigration, if we think about it, and refugees and asylum seekers, think about it on a much smaller level, because this virtue of prudence also has to be engaged, as well as this desire that we have to care for those who are vulnerable and in need. So think about this on a smaller, localized level, and imagine there's a family, mum, dad, 5 kids, they've got a 4-bedroom home, and they really want to do something. They're serious about their Christian faith. They really want to do something to help. So what they want to do is they want to open up their home and turn it into a 24/7 homeless shelter. Anybody can come into their home at any time. There are no questions asked. There are no locks on the door. There is no one is barred entry. And so they put this advert out, and very quickly, within a matter of weeks, they discover that all of a sudden their house is full of people, and they've got people turning up at all hours of the night and early hours of the morning. They've got people in their kids' bedrooms they don't know anything about. They are overwhelmed with people. They discover that all of a sudden their resources are consumed, and they don't have the ability to actually adequately care for all the people that they've taken in. They then discover that some of the people they've taken in have some very serious and dangerous personal issues that they are not equipped to deal with. Fighting breaks out between groups of people who are staying at their house. Their houses ends up getting trashed. A lot of their resources that they need are actually damaged in the process. This starts to become such a regular occurrence that the husband has to actually start taking days off work to spend at home to resolve these issues, and eventually his employers say, look, you've got no time left, and he eventually then starts taking unpaid days, and the money coming in to feed his family and to look after these people they're supposed to be sheltering is not what it should be, and then before too long his employers just say, look, we can't keep this up, we're going to have to let you go. And now they've got a situation where they've got a house that's been ruined. The resources they need, mattresses and blankets and other things, have been destroyed or stolen. A lot of their property is gone. They don't have an income for their family. And they're now in a situation where, because of a lack of prudence, even though they started out with the most important ideal in mind, that they wanted to show love and care for the vulnerable, they have actually ended up doing something that was imprudent and actually, really, when you think about it, quite foolhardy. And they didn't consider the issue properly, and as a result, not only are they unable to actually carry on caring for people, so they can't provide any care to vulnerable people now because of their lack of prudence, but they themselves are now destitute. And I think that's a really important example to keep in mind when we think about this issue, because a lot of people are demanding things of their own countries and their own governments that they would never accept in their own homes. And I think that's an important point to make, an important point to keep in mind. And one of the key things you've always got to balance here, when it comes to Christian morality, and particularly caring for the vulnerable, is in your effort to care for the well-being of one group, refugees, you also have to balance that against protecting the well-being of another group, which is the citizens of a nation. And so the state, the government, has to keep those two things in balance. So therefore, I would argue that this concept of just open borders and no real controls or very minimal security checks, and just we'll take anybody and just keep sending them, I would say that's not really an authentic policy that authentically represents the Christian principles and how these Christian principles should be outworked. Which brings me to point number 3. Number 3 is that you accept asylum seekers and refugees as long as you have the available resources and space and personnel and everything else to actually do that. And you would also have prudent security measures, like, for example, you would check for things like, infectious diseases that, could outbreak. You would check for, people who might in fact be soldiers or who might be terrorists. So there would be prudent security checks put in place as well. I would suggest to you that this is an authentic application of those Christian principles regarding care for the vulnerable. So you are definitely reaching out to those who are in need. You are caring for the stranger. You are caring for the vulnerable. You are making a space for them and for the care of those people. But at the same time, you're also keeping that prudent balance of making sure, if this is the government here, the state, is also protecting the citizens and the well-being of the citizens that exist already within that community. And that's really, really important, because you can't have, you certainly can't care for the vulnerable if you don't have a just and stable civil order, if the common good is not being upheld. And the quickest way to undermine the common good in a society is to have a breakdown of law, to have lawlessness, to have economic hardship. And if you were swamped with refugees and you were not capable of handling them, if you were swamped with refugees who were in actual fact people with very violent tendencies or very serious issues that they were bringing into your country, that could also cause to a breakdown of just and stable civil order and therefore the common good. And as a result, not only are a lot of other people in your own nation end up in a situation where they are being harmed now, no longer are you actually able to care for these vulnerable people at all on an ongoing basis because you haven't been prudent, but also you have now brought a whole lot of people, refugees, into your country in a way that has, in actual fact, not benefited them at all. It's just, you have, without keeping balance, you could well end up destroying your own economy or your own security, and as a result, those people themselves are now stuck in a situation where they can't flourish. So they've gone from one bad situation to another bad situation, and that is not good for anybody. So I think, for me, the Catechism of the Catholic Church has a paragraph which specifically addresses this issue, and I think, for me, it sums up perfectly this particular response. It's, for those who are interested, it's Article 2241, and it says this: the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, so again there's that prudence, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. Public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. Political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrant's duties towards their country of adoption. So in other words, even people who are coming into your nation, they have obligations on them as well. It's not just a one-way street where all the moral obligations are on, in this case, say, America. There are also obligations on the refugees who come into that country, and you very rarely hear people talking about that. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them. Now, that's important. The West is Christian through and through. The way our institutions are structured, the way we view the human person, the way we think about freedom and rights, they are all because of foundational Christian principles. Obviously, Islamic nations have a different approach and approach those issues often quite wildly differently. And they also have a different concept of how the state should be run and how the individual relates to the state. And so these are pretty big issues. And so if you're a Muslim coming into a Western country, the Catechism here talks about the fact that you clearly have an obligation to respect the material and spiritual heritage of that country. And lastly, to obey its laws and to assist in carrying civic burdens. So in other words, this passage here is basically trying to sum up what I've been saying, that it's about maintaining that balance. Yes, you must care for the stranger. Yes, you must be open where possible to helping refugees, but at the same time, that must also be balanced against the other important concerns about making sure that you don't sacrifice the common good and destroy a just civil order, or wreck the economy in your own country in the process, because that would be harming a whole lot of other people. It's about two groups of people that have got to be protected here, that have got to be allowed to flourish. Which brings me to point number 4, because in actual fact, I think this is one of the authentic Christian expressions of these principles we find in Scripture, but it's not the only one. And this is important because option number 4 is you can, without necessarily taking refugees into your own country, you can help refugees in other ways. You could go into those war-torn or disaster-ravaged areas and address the issues, fix the actual root cause of the problem. Help with infrastructure. If you have if you've got asylum seekers and refugees from earthquake-ravaged or flood-ravaged nations, one of the best things you can do is go into those nations and first of all start by building up the infrastructure, and then start trade with those nations. Because one of the things that we're very good at is rushing into foreign nations and throwing aid and throwing supplies at them. But often those supplies actually end up doing more harm than good, because we end up undermining the local economy. The local rice farmer doesn't have anything to sell if America is shipping in, pallets and pallets by the hundreds of tons of rice and giving it away free. So that's actually detrimental. So we can trade with them. We can help with infrastructure. We can take in, military teams if need be to act as police forces and to help restore order. We can fund various programs which help refugees. We might fund refugees to be located in a more appropriate local region temporarily before they go back into their own home country once the issues have settled down. We might help particularly refugees from cultures that are not Western. We might actually have programs that we fund where they are relocated into neighbouring countries, safe countries, where in actual fact the culture shock is not so big for them. I mean, we all think about coming to New Zealand or going to America or England or Scotland as a refugee, and we think, it wouldn't be so bad, because it's not really a foreign culture to us. There's some differences to get used to, but the culture shock is not really that great. But for someone, say, who's in a Middle Eastern country to have to come to a Western European nation, it's a massive culture shock. It's a very different way of living out your daily life and the ways the state and society and culture functions. And so imagine if you had to leave your Western nation and be a refugee fleeing to go to somewhere and live like somewhere like Afghanistan or Yemen or Saudi Arabia. It really would be quite a different experience for you. It really would be a culture shock. Whereas if there was an option, say, to be relocated as a refugee to Australia, that would probably be a lot easier, particularly if you've got wife and kids and children. That would be far easier and far more straightforward for you. The other thing, as I understand it, is that for the same price as it costs to relocate 10,000 refugees from the Middle East over to the West, you can relocate more than 100,000 refugees in other Middle Eastern countries. So in that way, you're getting more bang for your buck, which is good, because it's not about the money, it's about the fact that you can help more people. You're actually being more effective in your help. And that, option number 4, would also be a Christian response. Even if you didn't necessarily take refugees into your own country, by in actual fact aiding and going to their aid in other ways would still be an authentic Christian application, I think, of those principles. So as you can see, it's not really a straightforward issue. It's not really a matter of taking one Bible verse or a couple of Bible verses and then just saying, right, there you go, there's your immigration policy. There's certain things that have to be kept in balance, and there are, in fact, a couple of different ways that you could actually, probably more than a couple of different ways that you could respond in a way that is moral, that is authentically Christian, which brings us to the question of the hour. Does Donald Trump's temporary suspension of immigration, this 3-month temporary suspension that he's put in place from those 7 nations that are considered terrorist hotspots, does that violate Christian teaching? Well, and I've been thinking a lot about this over the last couple of days, and even though I am critical of this particular executive order, for me, I think it was implemented haphazardly, which actually, does put vulnerable people at risk, and I think that's good. I also think that this is an executive order that should have been part of a much bigger proactive strategy as well. So this is a reactive thing. They've shut down a border to 7 different nations that are terrorist hotspots. But at the same time, it seems like the vulnerable people from those communities who actually do need help have been forgotten. There's been no proactive strategy at the same time for addressing and putting things in place that might look at addressing that particular need as well. So to me, it just felt like it was reactive only. Having said that, on the bigger question, does this violate Christian teaching to implement a temporary 3-month ban on immigration from countries that are considered dangerous areas? Well, I don't think the answer is yes at all. I don't think it does. And I'll tell you why I don't think it does. Because, first of all, it's only temporary. We're talking 3 months. That's it. It's only temporary. If this was a permanent ban, that would be a different question. Secondly, this the stated aim that they have given is so that they can give themselves breathing room to ascertain that they do have proper safety and security measures in place for their own people, to protect their own people. And I think that's a valid concern. You can't just assume that the Obama administration had it right. There's lots of things that they didn't get right. There's lots of things that governments don't get right all the time. And people seem to be assuming that the previous government just had it right. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And so if you've got a new administration, it's not unfair of them to say, well, we need 3 months to actually give ourselves some breathing space to ascertain that we've got good procedures in place, and that it would be appropriate again to open up those borders, and we'll go from there. If they keep making this an ongoing thing and it becomes permanent, well, obviously that's a different moral question then, isn't it? The other thing is that I think this is definitely a very real threat. ISIS have been stating for quite some time now that they want to use refugee channels out of these Middle Eastern countries to pipe terrorist fighters into the West, so they can carry out acts of terror, and they will be able to get easy access to the West through these refugee pipelines. And so there's no doubt that this is a very real threat. This is not something someone's just fantasized about or thought, oh, what if some extreme worst case scenario. There's a very real threat, and we've actually seen this already play out in Europe, where this very thing has happened. Which, by the way, I think is a good way to think about those silly memes that people have been throwing around, and those articles and commentaries that have been taking the number of death statistics in America for the last couple of years and saying, that you're more likely to be killed by falling out of bed than you are by an Islamic terrorist in America. That's an absurd and totally illogical way to look at this issue, because the reason this temporary suspension has been issued is not because they said there's a high number of Islamic terrorist acts happening in our country and people being killed and we've got to do something about it. That's not what this suspension is about. Instead, the reason this suspension exists is because they have looked ahead, they have looked at the shifting landscape, they have looked at the situation overseas, and they've said, how might this affect America? How should we respond in order to future-proof our nation and to protect it from future threats? How do we make sure that we're ready and prepared? Now, that's a really good thing. And by the way, a lot of people, including the same people now who are criticising this temporary suspension, were very critical of the fact that America didn't really do this prior to the 9/11 attacks, that they got slack. Yet, despite the fact that there were a lot of warning signs and there were people who were saying this was an issue, and those people were not really being listened to. And so they didn't take prudent, forward-thinking action. So this is really what you want your government doing, to actually be thinking and looking forward. You don't want a government that looks at statistics and says, oh, well, we haven't had a major viral pandemic in a long time, so there's no chance of that happening. We don't need to do anything to prepare for that. That would be absurd. That's effectively what these memes are asking people to buy into. This idea that just because something has happened in the past, it's going to keep happening in the future. Like I said, that completely fails to take into account the very real situation that the world is now facing as a result of Islamic terrorism in those regions and the spillover into all sorts of nations, and the way in which refugees are now flowing, and some of those, I guess, freeways, if you like, that have started to open up, and how that has an impact on national security. So those memes, as I said, they're not logical. In my city here, about 6 years ago, we had a series of very serious earthquakes, and the second earthquake killed a whole lot of people in a very quick period of time. And what those earthquakes revealed, though, was that a lot of us were not really prepared like we should have been. We didn't have good disaster emergency kits ready. We didn't have emergency plans ready. We didn't even know what to do if there was a tsunami, even though our city is a coastal city. And the thing, though, was that we should have had those things in place. Despite the fact, when I was growing up, for the first 36 years of my life, most of it spent in this city, there was a total of 3 earthquakes that I can remember, and they were just shakes, little wobbles, and that was about it. But in actual fact, if we'd gone and looked at the seismologist data and what the actual science was telling us, we should have been a lot more cautious, and we should have been a lot more prepared for this, because this was a possibility. And it's the same sort of thing here. This is not about what's happened in the past or what's currently going on in the ground in America. It is about preparing for very real possibilities. It is about putting contingency plans in place to try and limit the harm of something that could become a very real possibility in your country. The other thing I'd say about this temporary suspension is that it does not ban Muslims. It is, if you heard people saying that is not true. There is not a single mention of the word Muslim in this executive order. Now, by the way, one of the things I did when I first heard about it, within the first 24 hours or so, was I actually went and read the executive order. I thought, I've got to read it for myself. When I did that, I discovered that it was a rather shockingly boring and uncontroversial document. It doesn't mention the word Muslim. It doesn't mention the word Christian. It doesn't favour Christian immigration or refugees, by the way. What it does do is it has a clause in there, clause 4E, which gives preference to people who are persecuted minorities and to others as well. It actually says in that same clause that the relevant authorities, if they deem it safe and appropriate, can allow refugees from those 7 nations into America on a case-by-case basis. So it actually has that clause in it as well. So for all of these reasons, I don't think you can say that this temporary suspension is an explicit violation of Christian teaching. I really don't. I really don't think you can say that. The one thing I think you could possibly, the criticism you could make is around the fact, what I said before, I think there's a weakness here so far, but this administration's only, 10 or 11 days old. And you've got to give them some slack. But the one thing I would say is that if you're going to rush to do something like this, then surely it's also worth pushing ahead with plans to help and to really secure safety and care for those vulnerable refugees. And so I think that's one area that could be lacking. But this temporary suspension is about making sure that the nation is safe. That's quite a different question. Like I said, a lot of people seem to be expecting the government to do things with their country that they would never ever allow with their own home. They wouldn't simply have their home open to anybody and everybody who turned up at their door any time, day or night, no questions asked. They would take appropriate precautions. They do keep their doors locked. And at the same time, they're still a welcoming home. They will welcome and care for people who come to their door. It's just that, sometimes they can't care for people. They might be sick themselves, or they might be not so well off, and so they have to slow down on their reaching out work that they do. And the same is true for a nation. And a lot of people don't seem to be keeping that in context. So to finish up with, I apologise to anybody who, if you were looking for some sort of concrete, solid, definitive smackdown on this issue, like I said, this is a complex issue. And for me, these videos are more about a conversation anyway. I'm sharing my views here, and I've tried to systematically lay out, what the Christian teaching is on caring for the vulnerable and those who are in need and the stranger, etc. Loving your neighbour. But at the same time, when you're talking now about applying these at a much bigger level and on immigration policy, there are all these complexities and balances that have to come into it. So it is a bit more complex. I think, though, as well, I would say that some of the people I've seen who have been, really preaching this whole concept that this is a violation of Christianity and Christian teaching and, this is a great moral outrage that Jesus would be ashamed of, some of those same people have also been engaging in acts that I would say are definitely contrary to Christian teaching and lack virtue. Speaking extremely uncharitably and even hatefully about a political leader, while on the other hand you're trying to claim that Jesus wants us to rescind this temporary suspension, to me is not consistent. I think it was St. Augustine who famously said that the person who reads the scriptures and only listens to the ones they want to listen to is not listening to scripture at all, they're just listening to themselves. And I think some people have been doing that. And remember, Donald Trump is not your enemy. Donald Trump has human dignity as well. And he, just as much as any refugee, must be respected and shown charity by us. Otherwise, we are failing in our Christian duty as well. And it's no good pretending that we're super Christians, while we're screaming blue murder about a temporary suspension of immigration from 7 nations. And also, I encourage people to remember those important Christian principles around turning the other cheek and striving to be peacemakers, rather than looking to stir up needlessly divisions and tensions and other things. So I think that's really important as well. If we're going to claim to be Christian and we're going to jump in on this immigration and refugee question and shouting out Christian scriptures and Christian teaching, we've also got to make sure that we are at least striving to be consistent and that we really are Christian, not just in one area where it suits us. but we're completely ignoring it in others, because that is clearly quite contrary and quite a contrary witness. And I would also say that it's extremely, well, it's kind of ironic to see, like, for example, in England, there's a group of people who are trying to get Trump excluded from being able to visit their country on a diplomatic visit. And they're saying that he should be prevented from doing that. Which to me is kind of strange. If you truly believe that this temporary suspension is an exclusionary policy and that's why you want it stopped, why would you want to enact another act of exclusion to show how bad exclusion is? It just doesn't make any sense to me. I would also add that we've really got to work hard on dialogue. At the moment, it seems to me that dialogue between different groups has really broken down. In this case, dialogue is really important because of the fact that this gets so emotive and because there are a lot of complexities here. But we need to dialogue about these issues and actually engage with each other and with rational ideas and evidence and concepts, rather than just acting with this extremely emotive, reactionary and irrational kind of hysteria. Trump's not Hitler, as I said the other day. He's not the devil incarnate. And at the end of the day, this is not a Muslim ban. This is not comparable, not even close to what Hitler did to the Jews. So we've got to stop making those silly comparisons and actually just address the actual executive order and what it really does. The best way to do that, I encourage you to actually go and read the executive order for yourself. It might take you about 15 minutes to read it, 20 minutes, and you might be surprised to discover how shockingly uncontroversial it actually is. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.